A year ago, the world seemed to come to a stop when our son was diagnosed with autism. As you can imagine, having a child who is nonverbal is incredibly difficult, and as a parent, your communication styles have to get a little creative. We're still very new in this journey, and it seems like we learn something new about our child every day and a different way to communicate with him. A favorite quote that I have found so far is, "If you've met one individual with autism, you've met one individual with autism." This journey is unique as each individual, and so are their communication styles and skills. Autism spectrum disorder has a significant impact on communication. Today I'm going to explain a little bit about the different styles of communication used by those with autism and how we can better educate ourselves to effectively communicate with them. So let's first dive into the different types of communication styles used by those with autism. There are three main categories that they fit into: unconventional use of language, nonverbal communication, and undesirable behaviors. Unconventional use of language. Many children with autism will use words to communicate, but in unusual ways. One of the major examples is echolalia, where the children will mimic words or phrases that they hear others say. They might see it on YouTube, they could see it on the TV, music, things like that, and then they will just repeat them. They may also use made-up words. So they could have a conversation with you, and in their head it sounds totally normal and a great conversation, and you might not have a single idea what they said. They will say the same words over and over, like my son's personal favorite is no. We hear that quite often around here. And they confuse pronouns and call themselves you instead of I. Nonverbal communication is a big one with children with autism, and it's a big one in our house as well. Learning and watching for these cues can be a full-time job because sometimes they're not always obvious. Some of the main examples of nonverbal communication include eye contact, which is a big one for children with autism because they tend to shy away from it because it makes them uncomfortable. Physically taking a person to an object they want instead of asking for it, pointing to certain things they want and also looking at the person that they would want to grab the object, and using objects to communicate. My son likes to bring his gallon of milk to us in his cup instead of just saying, "I want a drink." Undesirable behaviors. Many children with autism have difficult behaviors, and a lot of the behaviors stem from communication. Self-harming behaviors, tantrums, and aggression are typical in children with autism because they either need something or something about the environment that they're in is making them uncomfortable. Behaviors are a hard trait to manage, and most typically the way to calm normal children would not work in this situation with children with autism, and the main way to get them to calm down is to take them out of the environment that's overstimulating them. According to the Australian parenting website on autism and communication, children with autism develop communication styles one at a time versus all at once as seen in typical children. This is typical for children with autism to focus on one area at a time versus trying to do multiple things at once because it will send them into a sensory overload trying to do too many things at once, and then it will inflict the undesirable behaviors as talked about earlier. Now that we're able to understand a little bit more about the different styles of communication, let's learn a little bit more about how we can better educate ourselves to communicate effectively with them and cause less frustration. Some helpful tips and tricks for communicating with those with autism are using short sentences like "go by" instead of "do you want to go?" Exaggerating your tone of voice like "oh, that was very scary," or "no, we don't touch that because it's very hot." Trying to use language that invokes simple answers. So, for example, "do you want cereal?" would be a great way to communicate with them because they're able to say yes or no, or they could simply shake their head yes or no. The biggest and most important thing to learn when communicating with people with autism is to have patience. If you ask a child a question, you need to learn to give them plenty of time to answer because it takes them a long time to process in their head what you're saying, and so to come up with an answer might take a little bit longer, and speeding it up is only going to cause more frustration. Take things slow and one at a time. Too many ideas at once will cause the sensory overload. According to Tatum D., the author of Can the World Afford Autism Spectrum Disorder, communication doesn't always have to be verbal. Communication often contains things like acts, events, or even signs. This is extremely important to realize for children with autism when we have to get creative in our ways that we learn to communicate with them. Take, for example, my son, who will, when he says hello to somebody, will raise his eyebrows when he looks at you versus saying hello. In this speech, I explained how autism affects communication and how we can better educate ourselves to communicate with those with autism. It's understandable that we can become frustrated when somebody doesn't communicate in a typical way that we're used to. But one of the biggest takeaways to remember is that an individual with autism is simply just that. They're an individual just like us. And being nonverbal doesn't mean anything other than the person just has a different way to communicate. We need to learn to be flexible in our everyday lives, and being flexible when we communicate with those with autism is imperative, and it can make all the difference in their world.